Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox. It is 8:57 on the East Coast and 5:57 on the West Coast. We are following some breaking news coming in from Ukraine right now as a Russian drone hit a bus evacuating civilians from a frontline area in Ukraine's northeastern region Saturday, killing 9 people. That's according to Ukrainian officials, and this was hours after Moscow and Kyiv held their first direct peace talks in years that failed to yield a ceasefire, but did lead to the exchange there of 1,000 prisoners of war on both sides. We do have this post as well as a picture coming in here from Volodymyr Zelensky. He is, of course, the president of Ukraine. He says there are currently 7 wounded people in hospitals following a Russian drone strike on an ordinary passenger bus. The victims have suffered burns, fractured, and blast injuries. All of them are receiving the necessary medical assistance. Tragically, 9 people were killed in that attack. Again, the photo there, very graphic, but did want to show you that post from Volodymyr Zelensky. Want to bring in Admiral Robert Murrett, a professor of practice at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs over at Syracuse University, to discuss all of the latest, including those peace talks, as I mentioned, that did not yield a ceasefire. Thank you so much for taking the time, as always, Admiral, to be here.
Morning, Josh. Good to be with you again.
Good morning. Well, first off, I do want to ask you about this drone attack. Your overall thoughts here as we've seen that play out over the last several hours and that post coming in from President Zelensky.
Yeah, Josh, it's tragic anytime to see this sort of thing happening. I think the overall point with this attack, or a lot of other drone or missile or manned aircraft attacks in Ukraine by Russia, is that they just have not been that discriminating in terms of the kind of attacks that they've gone after. I mean, over the past years, they've attacked schools, hospitals, apartment buildings. And, one of the things that we try to do, from our own standpoint, and something I used to have some responsibility for, is keeping collateral damage to an absolute minimum. And certainly anytime you drop what's called a DIMPI, which is a targeting point, making sure that the civilian casualties that may come out of that are as minimal as possible. And Russia just isn't that careful on these kind of strikes.
And again, you're looking at the post here coming in from Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, we had the peace talks over in Turkey. They went for about 2 days, but apparently only lasted for about 2 hours and ended with no ceasefire deal. There was that prisoner swap. So how significant overall is that prisoner swap that was agreed to?
Yeah, probably somewhere in the middle. Josh, I think most people would agree. I mean, it is good that finally Ukraine and Russia are talking to each other after a period of years when they haven't had direct negotiations. Having said that, there wasn't any significant outcome other than the prisoner exchange, which is noteworthy. It was 1,000 on both sides, and that is a good thing. So I think it's a positive step. What was lost in that is that originally the position by Ukraine, the West, to include President Trump and others, was that a ceasefire had to be a precondition before direct talks took place. They dropped that along with some other concerns. So it was not a great outcome, but the prisoner exchange is a good thing, but just a baby step.
Any surprise that the talks only lasted for about 2 hours? But on that same note, any surprise that Putin didn't show up? Was that even a real possibility?
I would say that neither of those two are a surprise, Josh. The fact they didn't last that long, they didn't have much to talk about because the Kremlin is knocking off what we call their maximalist demands that they've had, which are not reasonable and not acceptable to Ukraine or just about anybody else that's an independent observer. And the fact that it didn't last that long, they didn't have that much to talk about, quite frankly. And the representation was not at that high a level. It was higher on the Ukrainian side than it was on the Russian side, but Secretary Rubio was in the region and could have contributed. I think he did all the right things in terms of trying to set things up, but the Russian position was pretty much a fallback.
Why is Turkey the mediator? Again, these talks were held over in Istanbul, that is in Turkey. So why are they acting as the mediator?
Yeah, Turkey is probably as good as any country to be a mediator. China's trying to accept that role. Some of the Western European states, some of the more neutral ones like Austria and so forth. But Turkey is, at a crossroads. And President Erdogan has walked a pretty fine line since the start of this conflict. As you know, Turkey is a member of the NATO alliance, and they have done some things to support Ukraine, including, not in the least, keeping the Bosphorus closed to Russian naval ships that would like to plus up their naval presence in the Black Sea, for example. But I think Turkey is probably as good an intermediary as any. There are other actors that may emerge in the future, but they're not bad.
What sort of power does President Trump hold over a potential ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine? He has talked a lot about the fact that he could have a direct conversation here about all of this with President Putin. But what sort of power does he hold? If President Trump says this war needs to end, does everyone jump and say, all right?
I would not say that's the case. Having said that, he can play a very constructive role, and I think that so far he has done that to some extent. He, as everybody agrees completely with him, is we want to stop the killing. That's a point that he makes over and over again, which I think there's universal consensus on. Having said that, people probably underestimate how difficult it's going to be to deal with the Kremlin on this issue, and their positions have been very clear for a long time, and they are demands that no reasonable independent actor, just even from a neutral standpoint, thinks that they should accept. So it's going to be tough to bring the Kremlin on board and to reach a middle ground, something that's acceptable to Ukraine. And also, a final point, all the other chefs are going to be in the kitchen before there's a final deal. And as an example of that, the sanctions, the economic sanctions against Russia are by so many countries, and not just Western Europe, but the Far East, countries like Japan. They're all going to have to knot vertical before any kind of deal is reached.
Is Russia, and this is obviously opinion based, but just based on what you've seen, is Russia actually invested in ending this war? Do they want to end it, or is it just kind of something that they're putting up a front for?
Yeah, I would say the latter, but an important caveat, I would say I always draw a distinction, Josh, between Russia and the Kremlin. I think if we had honest engine, no kidding, open polling by the Russian population, they're ready to get this thing over with right away. I think the Kremlin is in a different place. I think there's a pretty big disconnect between Putin and a small, inward-looking team of advisors that he's got in the Kremlin and what the Russian people really want, which is to get this over. So having given you that condition, I don't think that Putin is ready for any kind of deal. I think he'd rather, draw out this conflict a little bit longer because he thinks he's actually in a bit of an advantageous militarily, which is really not accurate.
What does a realistic peace deal at this point look like? If it were to happen in the coming weeks, months, or even in the next year, what would both sides need to agree to and maybe give up?
Yeah, great question. I would just make a few points that I think will have to be a key part of a deal whenever it is reached. And the first part of it, of course, would be the ceasefire. And as you know, Ukraine has accepted the unconditional 30-day ceasefire along the current lines of the conflict in Ukraine. Russia does not. So the first part is going to be a ceasefire. The other thing will be the territorial imperatives, which will be a tough issue for Russia to accept. As you know, there are 5 provinces or oblasts involved, and Russia has already claimed that they have Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, as well as Crimea. They don't have complete control over 4 of those 5 provinces. One, Luhansk, they've got most of it, but the other ones they do not. But they've already said they would demand Ukraine pull back and give them some additional territory as part of the deal. Another one, which I think we can probably just put in the background, hopefully, is that Russia wants Ukraine to explicitly state that they will not be a member of NATO. I think we can probably just soft pedal that one and put it off to the side because it needs to be managed and not solved. And then the most important issue, I would say, is security guarantees for Ukraine. And that could be some kind of a peacekeeping or peace enforcement state force from a neutral or other states that could act as a tripwire force inside Ukraine to make sure that this doesn't turn out to be like the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements, which Russia will violate in months or years and just invade once again.
And before I let you go, I did want to get your take on this, because we've seen Zelensky posting on social media and talking about it, but he does say that he's been on the phone with President Trump quite a bit over the last several days, this coming weeks after we saw that explosive exchange that happened inside of the Oval Office there during Zelensky's visit. So does it appear that the relationship between the two is somewhat less strained maybe than it was?
Absolutely. In fact, there was just a phone call you may have seen, Josh, yesterday, and it was a phone contact between not just President Trump and Zelensky, but also the leaders of Poland, Germany, the UK, and France late last night, European time, in the wake of the talks that took place in Turkey. I think the relationship is better now. I'd have to give a shout out to some of our European partners who have acted as pretty good intermediaries there to kind of lower the temperature. And I think they'll play. And it also gets to that important point, which is that all the other actors are going to have to play in this eventually. And the discussions between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky will be key. But there's going to be a lot of other actors in this as well.
All right, Admiral, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to join us here. Anything else you want to add about any of this? Obviously, a lot to discuss, but anything you want to touch on before I let you go?
Yeah, Josh, just a final point I would make is that this is about Russia and Ukraine, but really one of the biggest incentives that Russia is looking for does not have to do with Ukraine. And that is specifically release from all the economic sanctions by all the countries around the globe, whether it's, Japan, Western Europe, and all the other countries that have strict economic sanctions against him. And also, Putin and his Kremlin team want to rejoin the family of nations and be able to go to make the G7, the G8, and attend all these international summit meetings because they're a pariah state right now. That's an incentive that doesn't directly have to do with Ukraine, but that's a major incentive for them to get to a deal.
All right, Robert Murrett, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. We appreciate it.
Good to see you, Josh. Good day.
And of course, taking you right back out to this post from Volodymyr Zelensky that came in a short time ago with some photos. So, of course, did want to make sure to let you know viewer discretion is advised here. But a Russian drone hitting a bus that was evacuating civilians from a frontline area in Ukraine's northeastern region, killing 9 people. That's according to Ukrainian officials. They said this happened hours after Moscow and Kyiv held their first direct peace talks in years, failing there to reach a ceasefire. Now, this post from Zelensky saying, quote, there are currently 7 wounded people in hospitals following a Russian drone strike on an ordinary passenger bus. The victims suffered burns, fractures, and blast injuries, all of them receiving the necessary medical assistance. Tragically, 9 people were killed.